All right, Shalom. I want to start off by giving all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashum, Yahweh Shai, Bahashum, Racha Kodash. I want to give double honors to our apostles and elders of Great Millstone who rule well, and grace and peace to you elect around the four winds, believing and pushing this truth in all sincerity. May the blessing of election be upon your houses. This is your fellow servant, Rochaya from the GMS Orlando camp, coming at you with another impromptu lesson. And as I was doing a little bit of research on the effects of this current oil and energy crisis on the economy, I came across this video from Peak Prosperity, which I want to get into a little bit through the spirit, because this guy does a pretty good job of explaining the correlation between energy and a country's prosperity, a country's economy. So without further ado, we're going to hop straight into it. I want to play a few minutes of this clip. We're going to grab a couple of precepts. Lord, when this is edifying unto you alike. All right, because truthfully speaking, this current oil and energy crisis is going to plunge the American economy into another depression-like state, just like America's seen in times past. All right, 4 other times, okay, with the panic of 1837, triggered by speculative lending and the collapse of state banks. All right, or the panic of 1893, triggered by the overbuilding of railroads and a run on the gold reserves, or the Great Depression in 1929, which we all know was triggered by the stock market crash, and the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, that was triggered by the collapse of U.S. housing and subprime mortgage market. Now we're seemingly entering into the 5th and final collapse for America Babylon the Great, which is possibly going to be triggered by this oil and energy crisis, this oil and energy shortage, as it were. But this is America's 5th and final collapse. All right, once Babylon goes under this final time, it's over. All right, there is no rebuilding, which the elites, figure that by the strategic dismantling of the economy, they're going to be able to rebuild into their technocracy, into their vision of having everyone chipped and traced, and controlling, buying, and selling through the RFID microchip. They think they're going to be able to rise from the ashes like the phoenix and rebuild like they've done in times past, but they won't be able to do it, according to prophecy. The Lord said that this is the final one. All right, and once they go under this last time, that's it. All right, that's it. So, I want to get into this video, but I want to grab this. Here. Let me grab this. All right. Thanks, Job team. All right, this is Job 18 and verse 5. It says, "Yeah, the light of the wicked shall be put out, and the spark of his fire shall not shine." All right, and the light of the wicked is currently being put out by truth. All right, the truth is putting out the so-called light of the wicked. And the spark of his fire is not shining. Once the Lord puts out his spark this 5th and final time, it's over with. All right, it says, "The light shall be dark in his tabernacle, and his candle shall be put out with him. The steps of his strength shall be straightened, and his own counsel shall cast him down." And the Lord put the so-called white man in such of a trick bag, that his own counsel is casting him down. The very same devices that he's came up with to keep the world subjugated, especially Negroes, Latinos, and Native American Indians. That same counsel is now starting to turn upon his own people. That same counsel is now starting to take effect, on his own. Just like Haman, in the time of Mordecai. All right, Haman devised a device to have all, the Hebrews hung, and he built gallows, which ultimately were used to hang him and his own family. And right now Esau's hanging his own self. He's essentially he's giving out the rope and tying the noose around his own neck. But it says, for he is cast into a net by his own feet, and he walketh upon a snare. The jinn shall take him by the heel, and the robbers shall prevail against him. All right, so they're not robbers, speaking about Yahushua, all right, which is coming as a thief in the night. Okay, Yahushua is going to prevail, all right, against this current evil, against this current demonic ruler. But without further ado, let's get into it, man.
Oil is the master resource. I mean, the capital letters master resource. This is the resource that allows all the other energy resources to be there. I mean, if you didn't have oil, you're probably not going to be building a big giant coal burning plant and running big giant machines to harvest the coal, because you need oil to do all of those things. So this is the master resource. And again, pretty much a straight line. This comes to us from, this is Art Berman's chart down here, Labyrinth Consulting Services. And again, GDP up the y-axis. GDP up the y-axis in this case, oil consumption across the x-axis in this case, both on a log scale, straight line. If you want to ask and answer a question, which is tell me how big an economy is, I could ask you how much oil it's consuming and get you about 95% accuracy to telling you how big their economy is. Right? Now, more reductively, perhaps, we can put the relationship between economy and energy like this. Okay? First, all economic activity is work.
Ready to learn more about Entivio today? Talk to your healthcare provider and visit Entivio.com. With Entivio, you may be able to pay as little as $0 per dose. Plus, our team can help connect you with additional support programs.
Entivio.
Looking for an easier way to get that LLC next to your business name? Say hello to Taylor Brands.
I watched that whole video without going through any ads. It goes to show you that Satan boy, he on his job.
We can put the relationship between economy and energy like this. Okay? First, all economic activity is work. All economic activity is work. Name me something somebody does, even if they're in the service economy, that doesn't require them to use energy, like work, right? They're using their brain, right? That's fueled by glucose that comes from food, right? And all work requires energy, all of it. So GDP measures the sum of all work then performed in an economy. Well, work requires a flow of energy. And the correlation between energy and output's not policy choice anymore, folks. It's a law of physics. It's actually one of those thermodynamic laws. Manufacturing. Every factory lathe conveyor belt runs on energy. Transport, obviously. Jet fuel, diesel fuel, bunker fuel. Agriculture, fertilizers, tractors, irrigation, shipping, transport, drying the grains. The digital economy still requires data centers, more electricity, sometimes than the whole nations. Construction, every building, bridge, road, obviously embodied energy in those activities. Healthcare, hospitals, pharmaceuticals, all require energy. Everything.
When you get into the transport, like it says, moving goods across continents requires fuel. That plays into what we see in 2nd Esdras. Second Esdras 6 and verse 22, it says, and suddenly shall the sown places appear unsown. The full storehouses shall suddenly be found empty. And that is hugely in part due to, this energy crisis, that's going to befall upon America. All right, that is befalling upon America. All right, they don't have the energy or the oil, all right, for transport. They don't have the energy or oil to maintain, agriculture or manufacturing or construction or healthcare or the digital economy, because you need energy in order to sustain the digital economy that Esau plans on implementing, which I know firsthand, Esau does not have the grid capability to sustain this new digital economy that, he's putting so much stake in. That's why we see things like 15-minute cities, and him trying to corral everybody into one central point, because you still have somewhat rural areas in Babylon the Great that don't have the grid work, all right, to handle the digital economy, that he plans on implementing. So he has to corral people just like cattle, into some central areas in order for this to work. Or, and that goes into, Revelation 13, where it says, and those who receive not the mark shall be killed, going into omitted out of, the society, omitted out of the digital economy, which essentially is them being ostracized from society. You're on the other side of society while everybody else is, continuing on and buying and selling. You're, off the grid somewhere, fending for your own. That's the only way this is going to work, because he does not have the capability. If it was up to him, he would have, took a couple more years to get things straightened out. But pursuing the Revelation 12 and 12, he has but a short time, and he knows that. So he has to move with what he has now. He has to try to make it work with what he has now, which he doesn't really have much. He doesn't really have much to work with. But I'm gonna rewind it a little bit.
Jet fuel, diesel fuel, bunker fuel, agriculture, fertilizers, tractors, irrigation, shipping, transport, drying the grains. The digital economy still requires data centers, more electricity, sometimes in the whole nation.
Another point I also wanted to mention as well, when you go into manufacturing, transport, agriculture, construction, and healthcare, these are all job avenues, that are going to be cut short as well. Like we read in time, in last video, Ecclesiastes 12, the grinding ceasing. All right, we read in Isaiah, the 19th chapter, about there being no work for the Egyptians. All right, which the modern day Egyptians, no work in Egypt, Salakia. All right, which the modern day Egypt is America. All right, we're coming into that point to where the grinding is ceasing. And this plays a huge factor into the grinding ceasing, all right, for America, Babylon the Great, which in times past, every single depression, that America has seen in 1837 and 1893, 1929 with the Great Depression, 2007 to 2008 with the Great Recession, all right, all of those triggered mass job layoffs and mass job loss. So we're seeing another trigger happen, all right, with this oil and energy crisis.
Construction, every building, bridge, road, obviously embodied energy in those activities. Healthcare, hospitals, pharmaceuticals, all require energy. Everything requires energy. Everything. All economic activity, I don't care what you think of, requires work. And all work requires energy. This means we're down to this thing called reality. And reality is immutably anchored in physics.
And reality is immutably anchored in prophecy, because this reality was a reality that has been prophesied for years now, starting with our elders apostles and their elders apostles. All right, the elder apostle to on down. Okay, this reality that we're starting to experience has already been prophesied since the late 60s. Since the late 60s. We already, listen, this reality that everybody is now starting to face, the prophets have been speaking about for years. This is why the Lord said in Isaiah 55 and verse 11, it says, so shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereunto I sent it. So the word of the Lord is being accomplished. The word of the Lord didn't go out void. All right, when the Lord spoke about the grinding ceasing and there being sedition among men, and there being a collapse of the society, race wars, earthquakes in diverse places, the love of many waxing cold, the mark of the beast, World War III, the nations turning against America. When the Lord spoke of all these things, people thought that, it was just vain words. But now we're starting to see the inevitable reality that is prophecy. And now, like this guy said, everybody is being faced with that reality. It's unescapable.
The embodied energy in those activities, healthcare, hospitals, pharmaceuticals, all require energy. Everything requires energy. Everything. All economic activity, I don't care what you think of, requires work. And all work requires energy. This means we're down to this thing called reality. And reality is immutably anchored in physics. And I know that as a nation, we've strayed from respecting, if not honoring, or even noticing reality, often preferring instead powerful narratives. But reality cannot be ignored forever. Ayn Rand put it really nicely. She said, we can ignore reality, but we cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. So we have a banquet of consequences coming, and what we're doing is we're risking economic collapse here. And so let's start here. Okay. Look, crude oil, that's what runs the world's economy. Not butane, not propane, not ethane, right? These are small, little, simple molecules. I mean, they're very useful molecules, but mostly for cooking and as feedstock inputs to plastics and stuff like that. But they do not power our ships, our jets, or our trucks. And I raise this because for some reason, the main oil tracking and reporting agencies, the EIA and the IEA, began smashing all the hydrocarbons into one messy bucket and calling it petroleum, or all liquids. And this is confusing because to a guy my age, when I grew up, petroleum was synonymous with oil. You could say those interchangeably. I meant oil. I said petroleum. I said petroleum. I meant oil. But as happened with COVID, remember when vaccine suddenly had its definition changed by the CDC midstream and we suddenly didn't know what it meant anymore? Petroleum suddenly now means that anything made of carbon and hydrogen that came out of the ground, pretty much. So now we have to perform the extra step of backing these non-oil hydrocarbons out of the equation because they're not the same thing. You can't, it's all messy. So let's make it simple. And when we do that, when we simplify everything, what we find is that the world was producing and consuming about 86 million barrels of oil today right before the war. 86 million barrels of oil per day. And with the recent closures of the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the Red Sea, and Russia's losses now, the world finds itself missing approximately 12 million barrels per day of crude. So some math. 86 minus 12 gives us 74. Which is interesting, because that puts us currently as having the same amount of oil output in place as we had in 2011. You know why that's fascinating? Because since we now know that together, that energy equals the economy, we know that, is it together, we share that understanding, right? And oil is the master resource, right? In that economic equation, we are free to ask, you're free to ask, well, okay, how big was the world economy in 2011? Because if we remove that much oil and we have to go back to living in 2011, I thought 2011 was kind of a fine year. It was a fine year. Problem, though, is that in 2011, the global economy was 36% smaller than it is today. 36% smaller. In other words, if the situations with Iran and Russia aren't sorted out and quickly, the world is facing an economic contraction that would bring us back to 2011 that would make the Great Depression look absolutely tame. Because that was about a 25% reduction. This is...
All right, and that's where we headed. All right, we're headed back into another Great Depression-like state, which this next depression is going to make, like he said, this next depression is going to make the Great Depression of 1929 look tame. Because the Lord said in Daniel the 12th chapter that there's a time coming like never before since there was a nation. All right, once this economy tanks for this fifth and final time, all right, sedition is going to be at an all-time high. All right, because not only, you got to think about it, not only because the majority of the sedition is going to come from these disgruntled Edomites, so you have to think, not only are these Edomites, now losing a huge part of the generational wealth that they've accumulated in times past through slavery and through, other wicked means. Now, on top of losing all of that wealth, now the middle class is being phased out. Now a lot of them are forced to Now a lot of them are forced to go back into the workforce because retirement funds are drying up. Now a lot of them are unable to retire in general. You know, if you're a certain age, I forget the generation exactly that is unable to retire seemingly. You know, they're being fucked out of their own society. So a lot of the sedition that's going to take place as a result of this next economic collapse is going to be from a lot of these Edomites. And they're going to be disgruntled, you know, they're going to be armed, and they're going to be reverted back into their true estate, which is the basis of men. You know, they're going to do what they do best, which is to utilize the sword. And when we see that rebellion take place in America, Babylon the Great, it's going to be something like never before since there was a nation. All right, this is 2nd Esdras chapter 15 and verse 14. It says, "Woe to the world and them that dwell therein. For the sword in their destruction draweth nigh, and one people shall stand up and fight against another, and swords in their hands," which is speaking about race riots, you know, race wars in a sense. All right, one people standing up against another, which racial tensions here in America have been on an all-time high since 2020. You know, they've been continually and steadily rising since 2020. All right, now with the Nolan Wells situation and, you know, other, you know, Jake situations, those tensions are just skyrocketing, man. You know, we come to a point where Judah is fully roused up and they ready to rock. You know, they're not, you know, they don't feel like putting up with no more Esau's bullshit, man. You know, they don't feel like putting up with it anymore. Racial tension is at an all-time high, man. And it's only increasing because a lot of the news that Esau puts out is to fuel that racial divide. You know, it's to fuel that racial tension by, you know, strategically to get Jake to crash out, to justify him forcing his hand and bringing down martial law or some, you know, other, you know, wicked device. But it says, "For there shall be sedition among men and invading one another. They shall not regard their kings nor princes, and the course of their action shall stand in their power." All right. And that word sedition goes into a concerted attempt to overthrow civil authority. All right. When these people realize that their government, Trump, you know what I'm saying, this new regime really wasn't for their betterment, they're going to take action into their own hands. All right. And it's going to be hell on earth concerning Babylon the Great. You know, and whilst that hell on earth is taking place internally, externally, America is going to be facing hell on earth as well from Russia, China, and Iran. So Babylon's fucked on every sector. The Lord is attacking the enemy on every side. As Esau thinks he's sieging, you know, the American populace, especially you Negroes, Latinos, and the American Indians, the Lord has him in a siege. The Lord is besieging him with even some of his allies, you know, at one point in time. It says, "A man shall desire to go into a city and shall not be able." Speaking about martial law, "For because of their pride, the city shall be troubled, and the houses shall be destroyed, and men shall be afraid." All right, and that's the time that we're coming into.
36%. But this time could be even worse than that. Why? Because, well, we got extra debt and derivatives, quadrillions of derivatives to fuel that descent. And Trump and the neocons are risking a true economic catastrophe because I don't think they know what they're doing. But I'll tell you what prudent people are doing. They are preparing for this. We are getting
really going to the elect. The only prudent here in these latter days are the elect that are preparing mentally and spiritually. All right, like it says in Isaiah 33:6, "Wisdom and knowledge shall be the stability of our times, and the fear of the Lord is our treasure." Really, the only prepping that is going to, you know, prove useful here in these latter days is the prepping that Yahweh Bahasham Yahushai has caused us to do spiritually and mentally, you know, by consuming this word, you know, and being exercised in the word. You know, with that being said, that's really all I had. Lord, when this is edifying that you elect, I just wanted to get into a little bit of this information, you know, because this is the time that we're entering into. You know, this is a very near future for Babylon the Great. you know, and which is excellent news for us. But with that being said, shalom.